The smell of oil and rust clung to the air like an old song that never went away. The kind of smell that settled deep into the skin, into the hair, into the very bones of anyone who worked too long in a garage. Most of the men in that workshop wore it like a badge of honor, proof of their libido, proof of their masculinity. But when the scent followed her around, it was treated like something strange, like something unnatural. Her name was Naomi Carter, a black woman, a mechanic. Words that, to many in that small southern town, did not belong in the same sentence. Every morning she tied her coveralls tight around her waist, pulled her braids back into a knot, and walked through the steel doors of Carter's auto shop, the small repair business her late father had built with his hands. Every morning, like clockwork, she braced herself not for work, but for laughter. "Yo, Naomi, you sure you don't want trade that wrench for a frying pan?" One of the younger mechanics would call out, smirking. "Careful, she might chip her nail on that carburetor." Another voice would follow, sparking a chorus of chuckles. They laughed because she was a woman. They sneered because she was black. And they mocked because deep down they feared what she represented. Proof that skill doesn't carry a gender. Proof that talent doesn't carry a color. Naomi didn't answer them. Not with words. Her hands were her voice. She spoke through every bolt she tightened, every gear she aligned, every engine she brought roaring back to life. But no matter how many cars she fixed, no matter how many customers left whispering in awe, it seemed there was always someone ready to tell her she didn't belong. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but Naomi had grown up under weight heavier than this. She remembered being a little girl, following her father into the shop. He was a big man, with grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms, and a voice that rumbled like a steady engine. "Baby girl," he used to say, "this world is going to try to tell you who you are, but you don't let nobody's words tighten your bolts for you. You hold the wrench. You do the fixing." Those words stayed with her, like scripture carved into steel. Still the mockery chipped away. Some nights, after locking up, Naomi would sit in the silence of the garage and let the tears roll down her cheeks, staining her coveralls. She never cried because she doubted her skill. She cried because she wondered if skill alone would ever be enough to silence a world determined not to hear her. And then, one sweltering afternoon, the challenge came. A man in a tailored suit, shoes polished so brightly they looked out of place in that dusty garage, pulled up in a black sports car. It wasn't just any sports car. It was a rare European import, sleek and snarling, the kind of machine most mechanics only saw in magazines. But this one wasn't purring. It was dead silent, hood steaming, engine stubbornly locked. The man stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as though afraid the air itself might stain him. He glanced around the garage, eyes skimming past the men until they landed on Naomi, who was wiping her hands with a rag. "This is your shop?" he asked, voice carrying the weight of arrogance. Naomi nodded. "It was my father's. Now it's mine." The man smirked. "I heard there was a mechanic here who thinks she can handle anything, but I didn't know that mechanic was—" His eyes dragged over her from head to toe, the smirk widening. "You." The men in the shop chuckled under their breath. Naomi said nothing. She'd heard that tone before, dressed in different words, carried by different mouths. The man tapped the hood of his car. "This engine's locked up. None of the best shops in the city could fix it. Tell you what." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp check. He held it between two fingers like it was a piece of bait. $100,000. If you can fix this car, I'll write your name on this check. If you can't. He let the unspoken words hang heavy in the air. Then maybe you'll finally accept what you really are, out of your depth. The laughter in the shop grew louder. $100,000. To them it was a joke. To him, it was a game. But to Naomi, it was something else entirely. Her heart pounded, but her face didn't flinch. She stepped forward, took the rag from her hands, and dropped it on the workbench. "Pop the hood," she said. The man raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "Pop the hood," Naomi repeated, her voice steady as steel. The room quieted just enough for the sound of the latch clicking open to echo like a drumbeat. Naomi lifted the hood and leaned in. The men crowded closer, eager to watch her fail. The man in the suit folded his arms, a smug grin plastered on his face. But Naomi didn't hear them anymore. She didn't see them, All she saw was the machine in front of her, the tangle of wires, the seized pistons, the silent heart of a beast waiting to roar again. This wasn't just about fixing an engine. This was about fixing every word they'd ever used to cut her down. This was about her father's voice, about every tear she'd shed in silence. And in that moment, Naomi made herself a promise. I will make this engine roar, not just for the money, not just for them, but for me. Naomi's hands moved with the kind of certainty that only came from years of repetition. She reached for her tools, each one lined up neatly, each one worn down from use but still dependable. The socket wrench, the ratchet, the pry bar, old friends in a world that constantly told her she didn't belong. The man in the suit leaned lazily against the wall, his grin unshakable. You really think you can fix this? He asked. His voice was smooth, sharp, like a blade polished to cut without mercy. Naomi didn't look up. She'd learned a long time ago that her power lay in silence. Let them talk. Let them laugh. Her answer would come when the engine roared. But the job wasn't easy. The moment she touched the engine block, she could feel the heat it had trapped, the stubborn resistance of a machine that had been pushed beyond its limits. This wasn't just a repair, it was a resurrection. The younger mechanics gathered around, whispering like schoolboys. She's gonna blow it. No way she pulls this off. Man, this is $100,000 joke. Naomi tuned them out, but their words weren't new. She had heard them in high school when she signed up for shop class and the teacher asked if she was lost. She heard them at the trade exams, when the examiner raised an eyebrow and double-checked her paperwork to make sure she wasn't applying for the wrong field. She heard them even from her own family, sometimes voices that asked why she didn't just find something more fitting. But there was something inside Naomi that never bent, never snapped, no matter how many voices tried to cut her down. She'd been forged in fire, sharpened in silence. As she worked, her mind drifted back to the nights with her father. Nights when the shop was quiet, the lights dim, and he'd hand her a wrench twice the size of her little hands. You hear that sound? He'd ask, as a broken-down truck sputtered before them. Naomi would tilt her head, straining to catch it. That's a cry for help, her father would say, his eyes soft behind the lines of fatigue. Every machine's got a voice. Most people don't bother listening. But if you do, if you really listen, it'll tell you what it needs. Engines don't lie. People do. But engines, they're honest. She carried that lesson with her now as she leaned into the belly of the car, listening not to the men around her, not to the suit standing smug nearby, but to the silent plea of the machine. Hours stretched. Sweat beaded on her forehead, slid down her temples, stained the collar of her coveralls. Her hands grew dark with grease, nails bitten and jagged from years of work. She didn't stop. She couldn't. At one point, the man in the suit chuckled. You know, if you give up now, I won't hold it against you. You can still save yourself the embarrassment. Naomi tightened a bolt without looking at him. You should save your words, she said evenly. You might need them later. A ripple of laughter spread among the mechanics. Some laughed at her, some at him. But Naomi didn't care. She wasn't here for their amusement. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the shop floor, and still she worked. And when fatigue threatened to break her, when her hands trembled from the effort, Naomi whispered to herself words her father once told her. A mechanic doesn't just fix engines. Baby girl, a mechanic fixes faith. Don't let yours stall. Night fell. The men drifted home one by one until only the hum of a single hanging bulb lit the garage. The man in the suit hadn't left. He stayed, arms folded, curiosity flickering in his sharp eyes. And Naomi? She was still there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her back aching, her heart steady. She knew this wasn't going to be quick. The engine was locked in ways most people wouldn't even try to solve. But Naomi wasn't most people. When she finally leaned back, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, her eyes burned with exhaustion but also with fire. She wasn't done. Not even close. This was only the beginning. She closed the hood for the night, pulled the shop doors shut, and walked into the darkness with one thought echoing through her. Tomorrow, this car will speak. And when it does, the whole world will listen. The night air was heavy when Naomi stepped outside, her coveralls clinging to her skin. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that only small towns knew after dusk. But inside her chest, it wasn't quiet at all. Her heart thudded like a restless engine, thoughts racing, doubts creeping in through cracks she tried to seal. $100,000. The number lingered in her mind, but it wasn't the money that haunted her. It was the eyes. The eyes of every man who laughed at her, the eyes of the man in the suit who thought he'd already won, the eyes of her younger self who still remembered being told, "You can't," one too many times. She walked home with grease still on her hands, shoulders hunched beneath invisible weight. Her apartment was small, barely more than a room with a kitchen corner, but it was hers. On the dresser sat a faded photograph of her father, his smile wide, his hand resting on her shoulder the day she graduated trade school. She stood in that photo with a certificate in her hand and dreams in her eyes. Naomi sank onto her bed and stared at the picture. "I don't know if I can do this, Daddy," she whispered. "This ain't just a fix. This is everything. And if I fail—" Her voice broke. She let her head fall into her hands. For a moment, the strong mechanic was just a tired daughter, aching for her father's voice one more time. But in her mind, she heard him, clear as if he were sitting right beside her. "Engines don't lie, Naomi. You just listen long enough, they'll tell you what they need. Don't you quit now. You were born to make things move." She wiped her eyes, stood and rolled her shoulders back. Tomorrow she will return. Tomorrow she would not just fight a machine, she would fight every ghost that ever told her she didn't belong. The next morning, Naomi was back before sunrise. The garage was still, the air cool and damp with dew. She unlocked the doors, flicked on the lights, and faced the car again. That sleek monster sat in silence, staring her, mocking her with its stillness. She pulled on her gloves, took a deep breath, and began again. Hours passed. She stripped the engine down piece by piece, each bolt a battle, each gear a puzzle. Sometimes it felt like the machine was fighting back, resisting her touch, refusing to yield. But Naomi's hands were steady, her focus unbreakable. Still, doubt found its way in. By midday, frustration gnawed at her. She dropped a wrench and cursed under her breath, slamming her fist against the workbench. For a moment she wondered if they were right, if maybe she was reaching too far. That's when the door creaked open. The man in the suit strolled in, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. He looked as crisp as yesterday, not a wrinkle in sight. He surveyed the scene with amused detachment. "Still at it," he said, tilting his head. "I admire the persistence, I'll give you that. But persistence doesn't equal skill. You've bitten off more than you can chew." Naomi didn't answer. She lifted a part of the engine, studied it against the light, then set it down again. The man chuckled. "You know what this looks like? Desperation. A woman trying to prove she belongs in a man's world." Naomi's jaw tightened. Finally, she met his eyes. "No," she said quietly. "This is a mechanic fixing an engine. The rest is your story, not mine." For the first time, the man's smile faltered, just for a flicker of a second. Then it returned, sharp as ever. "We'll see." He leaned back against the wall, pulling out his phone as though this was just a show for his entertainment. Naomi turned away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of rattling her. She poured herself back into the work. Day bled into night again. When the others left, she stayed. When her hands blistered, she wrapped them and kept going. When exhaustion clouded her vision, she splashed cold water on her face and pressed forward. Each sound from the engine became a language only she could hear. The faint click of misaligned valves, the stubborn grind of a piston that refused to move, the breathless silence of a machine waiting for life. She listened. She adjusted. She fought. And slowly, so slowly, it began to change. By the third night, when she turned the crankshaft manually, she felt it. Movement. Resistance giving way, just a fraction, but enough. Enough to tell her she was on the right path. Her lips curved into a small smile. It wasn't victory yet, but it was hope. The faint movement of the crankshaft gave Naomi a surge of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. It was like hearing the first heartbeat of a newborn, proof that life was still inside, waiting. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile, to breathe, to believe. But belief alone wouldn't win this fight. The machine still lay in pieces, a gutted puzzle spread across the shop floor, and the world outside those walls still waited for her to fail. The next morning, she was back at it before the sun rose. She rolled up her sleeves and bent over the parts, her hands moving with careful precision. Every adjustment mattered. Every mistake could cost her not just the money, but her dignity. By mid-morning, the other mechanics trickled in. They watched her with thinly veiled amusement, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads as though watching a child play dress-up with tools too big for her hands. 3 days and the car's still dead, one muttered. She's wasting her time. She'll crack soon enough. Naomi ignored them, though their words dug under her skin. She'd learned long ago that silence was its own weapon. But not everyone stayed silent. One afternoon, as she stepped out briefly to grab water, she returned to find the hood closed. Her gut tightened. Something was wrong. She rushed forward, opened the hood again, and her heart dropped. A wrench had been left wedged deep in the manifold, jammed where it could have caused serious damage if she hadn't caught it. She whipped her head around, scanning the shop. A couple of the younger mechanics stood nearby, smirking. One of them, a lanky boy with grease smeared across his cheek, whistled innocently. Naomi clenched her fists. She wanted to shout, to curse, to demand why, but she knew the answer already. They wanted her to fail. They wanted to prove their laughter was justified. Slowly, she pulled the wrench free, set it aside, and went back to work. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But inside, a storm raged. That night, exhaustion weighed heavier than ever. She sat on the shop floor, her back against the cold concrete wall, staring at the silent engine. Her eyes burned. Her hands shook. "Why am I doing this?" she whispered into the empty room. "Why am I letting them break me?" And then, like an echo from the past, her father's voice filled the silence of her memory. Because every time they say you can't, you show them you can. Not with anger, not with noise, with results. She closed her eyes, let the memory steady her, then pushed herself up again. The following morning, Naomi doubled her efforts. She worked with a fire that made even the skeptics pause. She rewired the harness, reset the timing belt, and carefully machined a replacement part when none of the spares fit. Her focus was absolute, her patience unshakable. Days turned into a blur. She ate little, slept less, her world shrinking to nothing but the engine before her. And then, finally, the moment came. She tightened the last bolt, wiped her hands, and stepped back. The car stood whole again, sleek and silent, like a beast waiting in chains. The man in the suit appeared, as if summoned by fate. He strolled in, his grin unchanged, his confidence unshaken. "So," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "is it done? Or are you ready to admit defeat?" Naomi didn't answer. She slid into the driver's seat, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She inserted the key, her fingers trembling not from fear but from the weight of the moment. The entire shop gathered, breath held, waiting. Some wanted her to fail, some secretly hoped she'd succeed. But all eyes were locked on her. Naomi turned the key. The engine coughed, stuttered. I fell silent. A ripple of laughter spread through the shop. The man in the suit smirked. "I told you," but Naomi wasn't done. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and turned the key again. This time, her hand steadied, her focus sharp as a blade. The engine coughed again, then roared. A deep, guttural growl shook the walls of the shop, echoing like thunder. The sound filled the air, rich and powerful, alive. The car trembled, headlights flaring, exhaust bursting in sharp bursts of smoke. Silence followed for a single stunned heartbeat. And then the garage erupted. Gasps, shouts, the sound of tools clattering to the floor as jaws dropped. Even the smug man in the suit froze, his smile vanishing as he stared at the living beast before him. Naomi sat in the driver's seat, her chest heaving, her eyes bright with fire. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just let the roar of the engine speak for her. Because at that moment, the sound said everything. She was a mechanic. She belonged. And she had just made the impossible move. The roar of the engine hung in the air like a lion announcing its reign. It wasn't just sound, it was defiance. It was proof that Naomi's hands, her skill, her patience, had done what no one else could. The other mechanics stood frozen, their smirks gone, their laughter strangled in their throats. Some stared in disbelief. Others looked away, ashamed of every word they had thrown at her. The man in the suit, however, was the most rattled of all. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if staring too long might undo what he had just seen. He stepped forward, peering under the hood, scanning the dials, desperate for some excuse. Naomi climbed out of the car, wiping her hands on her rag. Her expression was calm, steady, like she had known all along this moment would come. "Well," she said, her voice low but firm. "Do you hear it?" The man clenched his jaw. The engine growled behind them, smooth, powerful, alive. There was no denying it, no excuses left. He reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out his checkbook, and with a sharp flick of his wrist began to write. His pen carved each number with reluctance, like every stroke was a wound. 100,000. He signed it, tore it free, and held it out. Naomi didn't move. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she locked eyes with him. "This isn't about your money," she said quietly. "This is about respect, about proof, about never doubting what you don't understand." The man hesitated, the check still hanging in his hand. Around them, the other mechanics watched in stunned silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Naomi reached out and took it, not because she needed it, but because he owed it. Because a promise, once spoken, must be honored. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Enjoy it," he said coldly. "But don't think this changes anything. You fixed one car. That doesn't mean you belong in this world." Naomi tilted her head, her voice steady as iron. "I don't belong in your world. I belong to mine. And mine has engines, truth, and results. That's more than enough." For the first time, the man had no reply. He turned sharply, his shoes clicking on the concrete as he stormed out, the echo of the engine's roar chasing him into the street. The garage remained still. Then slowly, one of the older mechanics, the same one who had once mocked her most loudly, stepped forward. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "Naomi, I didn't think you could do it. None of us did, but you did." Naomi glanced at him, then at the others. She didn't need their apologies. She didn't need their praise. The roar of the engine had spoken for her. That night, when the garage finally emptied and silence returned, Naomi sat on the hood of the car she had brought back to life. She held the check in her hands, staring at it not as paper, but as a symbol. Not just of money, but of validation, of every night she had worked, of every insult she had swallowed, of every time she had chosen persistence over despair. She thought of her father. She thought of the little girl holding a wrench too big for her hands, and she whispered into the empty garage, "We did it, Daddy. We made them listen." But Naomi also knew something deeper, that this was not the end. This was just the beginning. Because the world outside the garage was bigger, harsher, and filled with louder voices that would laugh, doubt, and try to push her aside. But now, she had proof that engines don't lie. Proof that results speak louder than prejudice. Proof that once an engine roars, it can never be silenced again. And Naomi Carter, she was only just getting started. Word travels fast in small towns. By the next morning, whispers had spread from one corner of the street to the other. The black woman mechanic who had been mocked for years, she had done the impossible. She had fixed the car no one else could touch and walked away with a check for $100,000. At first, Naomi thought it would fade like gossip always does. But gossip has a way of growing legs, of running farther than anyone expects. By noon, customers she had never seen before started pulling into her garage. Some came out of curiosity, their eyes scanning her like she was some strange miracle. Some came with real work, cars that had been turned away by other shops. A few came just to see if the story was true. Naomi didn't speak much. She didn't have to. She let her work answer their questions, let her skill silence their doubts. But not everyone was pleased. The other mechanics in town, men who had laughed at her for years now, grumbled in corners, their pride bruised. They muttered that she had just been lucky, that the man in the suit had exaggerated the problem, that maybe he had even staged it. Anything to explain away what they could not accept, that Naomi had outshined them all. Even in her own garage, tension brewed. Some of the men who had worked alongside her now found themselves shrinking in her shadow, their egos pricked by the sight of customers asking for her by name. They began to leave tools misplaced, forget important steps, and mutter insults under their breath when they thought she couldn't hear. But Naomi did hear, and she remembered her father's words, "Engines don't lie, people do." So she ignored them. She poured herself into the work. Every car that rolled into her garage left with new life, every customer leaving with respect burning brighter in their eyes. Then came the reporter. A week after the engine roared, a local journalist walked into the shop with a notebook in hand. She was young, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her camera slung over her shoulder. She introduced herself, explained she'd heard about what happened, and asked if Naomi would be willing to share her story. Naomi hesitated. She wasn't used to attention. She wasn't doing this for headlines. She was just a mechanic. But something in the reporter's eyes told her this wasn't just about her. It was about every little girl who might hear the story and believe that they, too, could hold a wrench. So Naomi agreed. The article ran the following week. The headline read, "She made the impossible engine roar, the black woman mechanic who proved them wrong." The response was immediate. Calls poured in from nearby towns, then from the city. People who had never trusted a black woman under a hood were suddenly asking for her by name. Some came with broken cars, others came just to shake her hand. But with recognition came resistance. The man in the suit reappeared, his sharp eyes colder than before. He didn't come to congratulate her. He came to warn her. "You've made a name for yourself," he said, his voice low. "But don't let it fool you. Success paints a target on your back. People don't like when someone they thought is beneath them rises above." Naomi met his gaze steadily. "Let them aim," she said. "I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." He studied her for a moment, then smirked faintly. "We'll see," he murmured, before slipping back into his polished car. His words lingered, and in the days that followed, Naomi began to see what he meant. A supplier suddenly doubled her costs, claiming policy changes. A city inspector showed up unannounced, citing minor infractions that had never mattered before. Rival shops spread rumors, whispering that Naomi's fix had been a fluke, a stunt, a trick. But through it all, Naomi stood her ground. She worked harder, smarter, steadier. She let her engines speak louder than their lies. And still, late at night, when the shop was quiet and the smell of oil hung thick, she sat alone and whispered to her father's memory, "They're coming for me, Daddy. But I'm ready. I'm not that little girl with the oversized wrench anymore. I'm the black woman who makes engines roar." The days blurred together in the hum of engines and the scrape of tools, but Naomi could feel the weight shifting. Success brought her more work, more respect, but it also brought shadows. Shadows that crept in the corners of her shop, in the whispers of men who resented her, in the tightened smiles of rivals who wanted her gone. The first blow came quiet. One morning, Naomi unlocked the garage and immediately smelled it sharp, chemical, wrong. She rushed to her workbench and froze. The barrels of oil she kept in storage had been slashed, black liquid spilling across the floor like blood. Her stomach sank. Oil wasn't cheap. Cleaning it would take days. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to make a mess. They wanted to break her stride. Naomi knelt, dipping her fingers into the slick pool. She clenched her fist. Whoever they were, they didn't understand that mess and ruin had been her companions her whole life. She would clean it. She would rebuild. They would not break her. But the blows didn't stop. 2 weeks later, she lost her biggest customer, a small trucking company that had kept her father's shop alive for years. They called her, voice awkward and apologetic. "Naomi, listen, it's not you. You've done good work, but we've been told it'd be better for business if we went with someone else." Naomi didn't need them to finish. She heard the truth between the words. Pressure, whispers, threats from those who wanted her pushed aside. She hung up, sat at her desk, and stared at the unpaid bills stacked like bricks against her chest. The $100,000 check had helped for a moment, but it wasn't endless. And now, with suppliers raising prices and customers being pulled away, she could feel the walls closing in. That night, she sat in the garage long after the others had gone. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engines. She buried her face in her hands. For the first time in weeks, doubt clawed its way back in. Maybe they were right. Maybe the engine she had fixed was just luck. Maybe she had reached too high, too fast, and now the fall was coming. Her chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She whispered to herself, "Daddy, what if I can't keep it? What if I lose everything you built?" But then, as if in answer, the sound of a car outside cut through the night. Headlights spilled into the garage as a beat-up pickup rolled in, coughing smoke. A woman stepped out middle-aged, her clothes worn, her face lined with years of struggle. "You Naomi Carter?" she asked. Naomi wiped her eyes quickly, standing straighter. "Yeah, that's me." The woman nodded. They told me you're the one who can fix what nobody else can. My truck's been dead for months. Everyone turned me away. But if you can help me, I'll pay whatever I get. Naomi walked closer, placing a hand on the truck's hood. The metal was scarred, the engine clearly battered, but to her it wasn't just a broken machine. It was a lifeline for the woman who owned it. "I'll fix it," Naomi said softly, "and we'll talk about payment later. Right now, let's just get you back on the road." The woman's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. That moment reminded Naomi why she fought. It wasn't about the men who doubted her. It wasn't about the money. It was about people who needed her, people who had been turned away, people who deserved a chance to move forward. The next morning, Naomi's fire returned. She worked harder, faster, sharper. For every customer lost, she gained two more who believed in her. And slowly, word spread again this time, not about the $100,000 challenge, but about the mechanic who fixed cars nobody else touched. But the shadows weren't finished. One evening, Naomi locked up the shop and walked home, only to find a letter slipped under her door. No return address. Just 4 words, scrawled in rough ink, "Stay in your place." Naomi stared at it, her fists trembling. Fear twisted in her gut, but alongside it came something stronger. Anger. Defiance. She crumpled the paper, threw it in the trash, and whispered into the night, "This is my place. And I'm not leaving." What Naomi didn't know was that the biggest test was still ahead. A test that wouldn't just measure her skill with engines, but her strength to stand when the whole world tried to push her down. The letter should have shaken her, but instead it lit a fire. For days, Naomi moved like a storm through her garage, sleeves rolled high, grease on her arms, her hands steady as stone. She wouldn't let fear steer her. Not now. Not after everything. But the silence after the letter wasn't peace, it was warning. The rival she'd felt watching her finally made himself known. It was a Friday morning when a convoy of cars rolled up to her shop, sleek, black, polished machines that didn't belong on her side of town. Out of the lead car stepped a man Naomi recognized immediately, Victor Stanton. Victor owned the largest chain of auto shops in the state. He was wealthy, powerful, and ruthless, and he hated competition. Naomi wiped her hands on a rag, meeting his cold smile as he approached. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've heard a lot about you. The little miracle worker. The black woman who thinks she can build an empire out of rust and scraps." Naomi's jaw tightened. "I'm just fixing cars." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you're doing more than that. You're embarrassing men who've built their reputations for decades. You're stealing customers who've been loyal for years. And worst of all," he leaned in, his voice dropping, "you're proving that someone like you can succeed in a place meant for us." Naomi's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. Engines don't care who fixes them. They just care if you know how to listen. For the first time, Victor's smile faltered. Then he straightened, pulling a set of keys from his pocket and tossing them onto her workbench. Behind him, 2 men wheeled in an engine. But not just any engine. It was a monster, an exotic European build, the kind no one in town had ever touched. A tangle of wires, pipes, and parts that seemed impossible to piece together. Victor spread his hands. "This," he said, "is a machine no mechanic in this state has managed to revive. I've had it shipped, tested, taken apart by experts. They all failed. But since you're so extraordinary, why don't you show us what you can do?" Naomi narrowed her eyes. "And if I don't?" Victor's smile returned, sharp as a blade. "Then you shut down this little garage and stop pretending you belong in a man's world." The words hung heavy in the air. Naomi felt every insult, every laugh, every slammed door of her past pressing down on her. But beneath it all, something stronger rose. "And if I succeed?" she asked, her voice steady. Victor tilted his head, considering. "If you succeed, I'll write you a check for $500,000, cash. And I'll tell every paper, every shop, every customer in this state that Naomi Carter is the finest mechanic alive." The men behind him laughed, certain she would fail. Even some of Naomi's own workers shifted uncomfortably, unsure if she could face this challenge. But Naomi didn't waver. She reached for the keys, her fingers closing around the metal with quiet resolve. "Bring it inside," she said. "Let's see what this engine has to say." Victor smirked as if he had already won. "You've got 7 days," he said. "If it doesn't roar by then, you're done." He turned on his heel, his convoy following like wolves retreating into the woods. The garage was silent after they left, the engine sitting in the middle of the floor like a beast waiting to be tamed. Naomi's crew looked at her with a mix of awe and fear. "Naomi," one of them whispered, "this is suicide." Naomi looked at the engine, her mind already turning, her father's lessons echoing in her bones. "Engines don't lie," she murmured, "and I've never met one that couldn't speak." But as she pulled on her gloves and opened the hood, she knew this wasn't just about fixing metal. This was about survival, about proving, once and for all, that no one, not Victor Stanton, not the men who laughed, not the world that doubted her, could silence her. The fight for her future had begun. The next morning, the garage felt different. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the beast of an engine in the middle of the floor was watching them, daring them to try. Naomi circled it slowly, her fingertips brushing against the cold metal, feeling every dent, every scar, every whisper of history it carried. Her crew watched in silence. Some believed in her, some were terrified, and others, well, they were already imagining what would happen when the shop closed, when Naomi failed, when Victor Stanton's laughter filled the town. But Naomi didn't hear the doubts. She only heard her father's voice. The same steady tone that had carried her through childhood, through broken engines and broken nights. "Every machine tells a story, Naomi. You just have to listen long enough to hear it." And so she began. Day one bled into night, and Naomi worked without stopping. The engine was foreign, its design strange, but to her it wasn't just metal and bolts, it was a language. She tore it apart piece by piece, laying its secrets bare across the workbench. Her hands were steady, but her mind wandered. Back to the years she had been mocked, back to the customers who had turned away, back to the men who had laughed at the sight of her in grease-stained overalls. Every memory was fuel, every insult was fire. By the second night, exhaustion clawed at her bones. Her crew begged her to rest, but Naomi refused. "Engines don't sleep," she whispered, "and neither will I." She drank bitter coffee, wiped sweat from her brow, and kept moving. Her hands were cut, her nails blackened, her muscles screaming, but still she moved. On the third day, sabotage came. A part she needed had vanished. Someone, maybe one of Victor's men, maybe someone bought out from her own circle, had stolen it. Panic rippled through the shop. Without it, the engine was nothing but a corpse. Naomi stood frozen for a moment, the weight of defeat pressing hard against her chest. Then she breathed in, deep, steady, defiant. She pulled out her welding kit. Her father had always said, "If you can't find the part, you build it yourself." So she did. Through the long night, sparks lit the garage, painting her skin in fire. By dawn, her eyes were bloodshot, her hands trembling, but the part gleamed on her bench imperfect, handmade but alive. Day 4, day 5, every hour a battle. Some nights she slept on the shop floor, curled against the cold concrete, dreaming of her father's voice telling her to stand up. By the 6th day, word had spread across the city. Crowds gathered outside her garage, whispering, waiting, daring to believe. Some came to cheer, some came to see her fall, and somewhere in the shadows, Victor Stanton watched, certain that by tomorrow, the legend of Naomi Carter would end. The 7th day arrived. Naomi stood before the engine, her body weak, her spirit blazing. Her hands shook as she tightened the last bolts. Her lips cracked as she whispered, "Come on, baby, talk to me." The crowd outside had grown thick, spilling into the street. Reporters clutched cameras. Mechanics from rival shops folded their arms, and Victor stood at the front, smug, confident, already pulling out his speech of victory. Naomi slid into the driver's seat. The garage fell silent. Her fingers turned the key. At first, nothing. Just the hollow click of dead machinery. Whispers rose from the crowd. A laugh broke from Victor's lips. Naomi closed her eyes. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers, of the nights she spent under broken cars when the world told her she wasn't enough, of every single voice that told her she would never make it. And then she whispered, not to the crowd, not to Victor, but to the machine itself, "Roar for me." She turned the key again. This time a cough, a groan, a deep rumble that shook the walls, and then like thunder splitting the sky, the engine roared. The sound was raw, wild, alive. It filled the garage, burst into the streets, and swallowed the laughter whole. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, as if the entire city had been holding its breath, the crowd erupted. Cheers thundered through the air, people screaming her name, strangers hugging, reporters shoving microphones forward. Victor Stanton's face turned pale, his smile shattering. He stared at the machine, at Naomi, at the impossible reality before him. Naomi stepped out of the car, her hands still trembling, her eyes wet with exhaustion and triumph. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The roar of the engine said it all. Victor staggered forward, his voice hoarse. "Impossible," he muttered. It was impossible. Naomi looked at him, her gaze sharp, steady, unbreakable. "Nothing's impossible," she said. "Not when you've spent your whole life being told you can't." The crowd erupted again. Cameras flashed, and Victor, humiliated, pulled out his checkbook with shaking hands. $500,000, signed and sealed, handed over in front of the world. But Naomi didn't even look at the paper. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the little girls staring wide-eyed, the women wiping tears, the men who had once doubted her, now standing in awe. She knew then that this wasn't about money. It was about rewriting the rules. That night, when the crowd finally dispersed, Naomi sat alone in the garage. The engine purred beside her, alive and steady, as if it had become her companion in battle. She closed her eyes, hearing her father's voice once more. "Engines tell stories, Naomi, and so do you." For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile. They had mocked her, they had doubted her, they had tried to break her. But in the end, when the engine roared, so did she, and the world had no choice but to listen. When the world said impossible, she made it roar. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Colorless Voices, where we keep telling the stories of those who rise from the shadows, proving that courage cannot be silenced.